Imagine holding a tiny, heavy sphere in your palm. It feels reassuringly solid, smooth, and completely cold. It looks entirely inert, a dull gray object that seems completely detached from the violent machinery of the cosmos. Yet this harmless-looking object is actually a piece of a cosmic graveyard, a remnant of a stellar cataclysm so fierce it tore the fabric of space-time itself. This is the element that doesn't ask permission. It is a quiet agent of entropy, a molecular sniper that has spent millennia waiting to infiltrate our world, dismantle our minds, and subtly orchestrate the collapse of human empires. Every single gram of this heavy metal is an artifact from an ancient cosmic accident, forged in the blinding agony of colliding neutron stars. Long before our planet even coalesced from cosmic dust, two dead suns merged in a flash of incomprehensible power, unleashing a torrent of subatomic particles that slammed into lighter atoms, forcing them to grow heavy and dense. The universe literally had to tear itself apart to create this substance. It is the ultimate energetic dead end of the cosmos, a quantum fortress where time itself effectively stops. When you look at the periodic table, this material sits at a specific, fateful threshold. Its atomic nucleus is a tightly packed stronghold containing a magical number of protons, arranged in perfectly completed shells that granted an absolute terrifying stability. It represents the final resting place for radioactivity, the most unstable, volatile elements in existence, vaster and more furious than anything we can safely handle, spend millions of years decaying, throwing off radiation in a desperate bid for stability. But their journey always terminates here. Once a radioactive atom collapses into this specific configuration, it freezes forever. It is the ash of the universe's nuclear fires, a substance where matter finally surrenders to absolute stillness. But humanity did not see a cosmic graveyard. We saw an opportunity. Because of its peculiar chemical nature, this metal was almost too easy to domesticate. Unlike other materials that require furious furnaces and complex metallurgical secrets to separate them from their rocky prisons, this element practically surrenders itself to the flame. A primitive campfire possesses more than enough heat to melt it right out of its mineral host. It was our constant, heavy companion from the very dawn of civilization, tracking our progress from Neolithic settlements straight to the grand architecture of the Roman Empire. The ancients became utterly intoxicated by it. They lined their vast aqueducts with it, sheathed their warships in its heavy gray sheets, and utilized its compounds in everything from everyday cosmetics to kitchen cookware. But their fatal mistake was discovering its deceptive sweetness. When cooked in certain vessels, this metal transforms into a chemical psychopath, a quantum impersonator that effortlessly tricks our biological taste receptors. It masquerades as something nourishing, a pristine sweetness that masked an invisible, creeping madness. The ruling class of antiquity consumed this toxic luxury daily, unaware that they were systematically dissolving their own minds. A slow, agonizing biological sabotage began to take hold. The erratic behavior, the blinding fury, and the sudden, unhinged decisions of history's most notorious tyrants perfectly matched the clinical portrait of a brain under siege by this heavy element. It quietly eroded the intellectual foundations of an entire superpower, turning the cognitive architecture of its leaders into a porous, poisoned void. Yet, the very physical attributes that made it a biological saboteur also made it our most trusted shield against the invisible terrors of the modern age. Its immense density creates a nearly impenetrable thicket of electrons. When high-energy radiation rushes forward at the speed of light, it slams into this dense electronic cloud and shatters. The terrifying energy of radioactive decay is absorbed, scattered, and tamed by a wall of this heavy metal. We trust this silent executioner to guard our lives against the invisible bullets of nuclear fission, placing it between ourselves and the abyss. But our relationship with this element took a catastrophic turn in the early 20th century, driven by sheer industrial ambition. A self-taught engineer looked at the growing automotive industry and sought a solution to a mechanical flaw, a violent engine knocking that threatened to tear early vehicles apart. He found that injecting just a microscopic amount of a specific compound made from this metal into fuel created a perfectly smooth, powerful combustion. It was hailed as a brilliant triumph of human ingenuity, but behind the corporate applause lay a calculated, multi-billion-dollar deception. The architects of this industrial revolution knew exactly what they were unleashing. To keep the public from panicking, they intentionally stripped the true name of the metal from the product, rebranding it with a harmless, elegant pseudonym. With that single act of corporate sleight of hand, the universe's quiet agent of entropy was granted an official, unrestricted passport into the lungs of every single human being on Earth. The consequences inside the manufacturing facilities were immediate and horrific. Workers at the production plants began to lose their grip on reality. They hallucinated wildly, screaming that they were being hunted by invisible insects, before leaping from factory windows in states of absolute panic. The metal was executing a masterclass in biological camouflage, and its primary target was the delicate machinery of the human nervous system. To quiet the growing storm of suspicion, the inventor himself held a theatrical press conference. In front of a crowded room of journalists, he deliberately washed his hands in the pure toxic liquid and deeply inhaled its vapors for a solid minute, declaring it completely safe. What he hidden from the world was a grim reality. He was secretly battling severe poisoning himself, spending months in isolation just to recover enough strength to stand before the cameras. This foundational lie allowed the substance to completely conquer our atmosphere, setting the stage for a global crisis. To truly understand why this atomic infiltrator is so utterly devastating to living tissue, you have to look down at the physics of subatomic deception. Inside our bodies, another common element acts as the master courier of information, regulating the electric impulses that jump between our neurons and building our skeletal frames. But the ion of our heavy atomic sniper possesses almost the exact same electrical charge and radius. This near-perfect mimicry allows it to slip past 1 billion years of evolutionary defenses, effortlessly sliding through cellular channels undetected. Once inside the cell, this molecular saboteur begins a systematic campaign of terror. It binds to vital enzymes with a fierce, unbreakable grip, completely paralyzing their function. It violently displaces the rightful elements within our neural synapses, completely choking off the transmission of neurotransmitters. For a developing mind, the results are catastrophic. The brain simply stops forming the vital connections necessary to learn, grow, and adapt. Every single particle drifting from an exhaust pipe was a direct, permanent blow to the collective intelligence of an entire human generation. For decades, this invisible blanket of poison accumulated unnoticed, settling into the soil, the water, and the very air we breathed. The world was trapped inside a colossal, silent experiment in planetary poisoning, and the forces profit-driven industry were determined to keep the truth buried forever. But the true scale of this planetary contamination was about to be exposed by an outsider, a young, meticulous scientist who stumbled upon the horror completely by accident while trying to answer a question of truly biblical proportions. But the real horror was yet to be discovered. The young scientist was not looking for a global killer. He was simply trying to read the oldest clock in creation. He wanted to determine the exact age of our planet, a calculation that required measuring the ultra-trace amounts of this heavy element inside ancient, microscopic crystals. But every time he ran his advanced mass spectrometer, the numbers fluctuated wildly, mocking his precision. The machine was screaming a terrifying truth. The entire planet had become a crime scene. The element was everywhere, clinging to his clothes, floating in the pristine distilled water, and drifting through the laboratory window. To defeat this pervasive phantom, the researcher had to build a fortress of absolute purity. He engineered the world's very first clean room, sealing out the environment, filtering every breath of air, and washing his instruments in boiling acid for weeks at a time. Only by achieving an unprecedented level of isolation could he finally pierce through the industrial fog and isolate the true, uncorrupted signature of the planet's birth. He discovered that the natural background level of this metal had been artificially spiked by a factor of thousands. Driven by this revelation, he went from a quiet laboratory academic to a relentless investigator, venturing to the most remote corners of the Earth to map the boundaries of the infection. He dragged ice cores from the ancient, silent glaciers of Greenland and pulled water samples from the absolute depths of the Pacific Ocean. The physics of atomic distribution provided him with an airtight, undeniable case. In the deep, isolated waters of the ocean, the metal was virtually non-existent. But in the surface layers, the thin band of water directly exposed to the sky, the concentration spiked abnormally. When he sliced into the Greenland ice cores, he found a perfect vertical timeline of human industrial greed. For thousands of years, the ice remained pristine, whispering tales of a clean atmosphere. But then, hitting the exact layer corresponding to the early 1920s, The data didn't just climb, it underwent a violent, near vertical explosion. The sky had begun to rain the ash of leaded gasoline, settling into the snowcaps and entering the global water cycle. The corporate giants retaliated with immense fury, cutting off his research funds, threatening his university position, and smearing his name. Yet, like the rigid, unyielding crystal lattice of the metal itself, the scientist refused to break. He eventually proved a connection so dark it still sends shivers through the scientific community. This atomic saboteur doesn't just lower intelligence, it fundamentally alters human social behavior. When you track the rise of this airborne poison across major cities, you find a horrifying correlation that peaks exactly 20 years later. As the children who filled their lungs with this exhaust grew into adulthood, a wave of unprecedented, aggressive violence swept through society. By infiltrating the prefrontal cortex, the exact neurological region responsible for impulse control, empathy, and judgment, the silent agent of entropy was literally stripping away the biological brakes of human rage. It was a mass, involuntary chemical lobotomy inflicted upon millions of citizens simultaneously. When the additive was finally banned decades later, the crime wave broke and plummeted just as rapidly, a stark testament to the metal's grip on the human psyche. Yet, despite this horrific legacy, we remain deeply, hopelessly dependent on this element's unique thermodynamics. It is the core anchor of our global mobility. If you peek inside the heavy black box sitting in the dark corner of almost every car engine on Earth, you are looking at a masterclass in electrochemical permanence. For nearly 2 centuries, we have relied on a deceptively simple arrangement. 2 plates of this heavy metal submerged in a bath of harsh acid. When you turn the key to start your vehicle, a frantic quantum drama unfolds. The atoms on one plate eagerly surrender their electrons, while the atoms on the opposing plate greedily seize them. This violent exchange transforms the chemical bonds of the metal into a massive instantaneous torrent of electrical power. Hundreds of amperes unleashed in a fraction of a second. No other commercially viable material on the planet can match this absolute dependability. Surviving the biting frost of an Arctic winter or the blistering heat of a desert wasteland without flinching, it is a triumph of absolute electrochemical reversibility. When the engine runs, the process reverses perfectly, forcing the atoms back into their original places, waiting silently for the next command. It is an almost perfect circular economy, making it the most recycled object in human history. Yet, this cycle hides a darker, systemic asymmetry. While advanced nations boast pristine recycling loops, the true entropic toll is shifted to substandard, under-regulated facilities in developing nations. There, the primitive smelting of these batteries releases plumes of heavy dust into the air, creating silent zones of cognitive devastation where local children lose their intellectual potential to the unyielding weight of element 82. The metal doesn't need a smokestack to find you. It can wait silently within the very infrastructure of our cities, disguised as progress. When municipal managers in a major industrial city sought to cut costs by switching their water supply to a more aggressive, corrosive river source, they unknowingly triggered a catastrophic lesson in surface chemistry. The new, highly reactive water immediately began to eat away at the protective mineral crust that had built up inside the city's ancient plumbing network. Once that thin protective barrier dissolved, the water came into direct, naked contact with miles of old Sven-containing pipes. Without a scent, a color, or a taste to sound the alarm, the molecular saboteur dissolved directly into the drinking supply. For years, thousands of families systematically poisoned their own children from their kitchen taps. The tragedy proved that this ancient hazard is not a historical artifact confined to the ruins of Rome, it is a current, living vulnerability sleeping behind the drywall of millions of modern homes. But as our civilization races toward a high-tech future, this old enemy is preparing to make its most spectacular paradoxical comeback. It is positioning itself at the absolute frontier of clean energy, embedded within the next generation of advanced solar tech. Scientists have created groundbreaking crystalline structures that can absorb sunlight and convert it into electricity with an efficiency that leaves traditional silicon panels in the dust. And the crucial ingredient that gives these structures their near-magical optical properties is none other than our heavy, controversial element. Its massive atomic weight and strong electronic interactions allow electrons to move through these new solar films with unprecedented freedom, creating cheap, printable energy that could power the globe. Yet, We find ourselves trapped in a profound ethical deadlock. If these highly efficient panels are damaged by storms or discarded carelessly at the end of their life cycles, the heavy metal within them will inevitably leach into the ground, poisoning the very earth we are trying to save. We are holding a double-edged sword forged in the heart of a dying star, but the element's journey doesn't end on the surface of our planet. As we look up at the terrifying expanse of deep space, this ancient enemy transforms into our ultimate protector. When human explorers eventually leave the protective womb of Earth's magnetic field to journey toward Mars or establish permanent colonies on the lunar surface, they will face a relentless, lethal bombardment of cosmic rays and solar flares. To survive that silent radioactive void, our vessels and habitats will require a shield of immense density. And there, floating in the cold vacuum of space, the heavy, electrons-rich armor of this metallic graveyard will become the single line of defense between human DNA and absolute destruction. The very substance that eroded the minds of emperors and contaminated our global atmosphere will become the absolute guarantor of our survival among the stars. But the final mystery of this material lies far beyond human technology. It is woven into the ultimate destiny of the universe itself. Long before this heavy metal claimed its place in our industrial fuels, it reigned supreme in the dimly lit workshops of the European Renaissance, quietly steering the course of fine art through a toxic alliance with genius. The luminous, breathtaking light that defines the masterworks of the old painters. The ethereal, almost divine glow that feels as though real sunlight has been trapped inside the canvas, was not born from a purely spiritual inspiration. It was a triumph of heavy metal chemistry. For centuries, the only way to achieve a blindingly bright, perfectly opaque white paint was to grind down a dense mineral compound heavily saturated with our atomic sniper. This specific pigment possessed unique optical properties that no other substance on Earth could replicate. Because the heavy core of the element is wrapped in such a dense cloud of electrons, it exhibits an exceptionally high refractive index. When a ray of light hits a particle of this paint, the photons don't merely bounce off the surface. They are violently scattered and trapped within the layers of the oil medium, creating a profound illusion of internal illumination. The element had effectively learned to mimic the sun, turning sticky oils into an organic mirror for light. But the artists who sought this celestial brilliance paid a terrifying toll, unknowingly inviting a quiet executioner into their creative sanctuaries. The paint possessed a deceptive, slightly sweet quality when handled, which frequently led to accidental ingestion. The real danger, however, strictly belonged to the air. As the masters painstakingly crushed the dry pigment into fine dust to mix their paints, they filled their lungs with billions of microscopic, heavy particles. The element entered their bloodstreams, breached their skin, and launched a slow, agonizing campaign of neurological destruction. Historical autopsies and medical records of the era reveal a harrowing pattern of physical collapse among the world's greatest visionaries. One legendary painter, famed for his dark, chaotic imagery and sudden shifts into violent madness, spent his final years completely consumed by an agonizing, mysterious sickness. His joints stiffened into useless knots, his abdomen burned with unbearable cramps, and his mind fractured into a waking nightmare of terrifying hallucinations. He was not experiencing a mere artistic crisis. He was suffering from an extreme accumulation of this heavy metal. The very hands that gave the world immortal beauty were being systematically paralyzed by the molecular saboteur, which was busy dismantling the optic nerve and dissolving the cognitive architecture behind his genius. The material did not limit its deceptive charm to the canvases of the elite. It simultaneously conquered the grand banquet halls of royalty through the invention of a luxury glass that altered the physical nature of light. An ambitious glassmaker discovered that melting a heavy dose of this metallic oxide into a molten glass mixture fundamentally transformed its structural behavior. The heavy atoms worked like a cosmic anchor, slowing down the cooling process and granting artisans an extended window of time to twist, sculpt, and blow the material into intricate, impossible geometries. More importantly, this additive drastically elevated the glass's ability to bend light. When a beam of sunlight passed through a faceted vessel made from this heavy crystal, the light was violently split into a dazzling, prismatic spectrum of color that rivaled the brilliance of a diamond. Even the acoustic properties of the material were fundamentally rewritten. When struck, a glass enriched with this element does not give a dull thud. but sings with a clear, bell-like, long-lasting vibration. The immense weight of 82 protons had forced the rigid atomic lattice of the glass to vibrate at a frequency of pure music. Yet, even within these sparkling luxury decanters, the quiet agent of entropy had laid a lethal trap for human hubris. When acidic liquids like vintage wines or fruit spirits were stored inside these beautiful crystal containers for extended periods, a slow, invisible diffusion began at the surface boundaries. The acid systematically uncoupled the heavy metal from its glass matrix, drawing it directly into the liquid. The wealthy aristocrats who toasted their fortunes from these singing vessels were drinking a concentrated potion of slow death, gradually destroying their kidneys and corrupting their cardiovascular systems, while marveling at the diamond-like sparkle of their drinks, while this element was busy manipulating light in the studios of artists and the palaces of kings. It was simultaneously rewriting the brutal reality of global conflict on the battlefield. When the era of firearms dawned, military tacticians didn't choose this metal for their ammunition because it was cheap. They chose it because the laws of physics demanded its unique combination of weight and malleability. Because it is incredibly dense, a projectile made from this material weighs far more than an identical bullet made of iron or copper. This immense mass grants the projectile a devastating amount of kinetic energy and momentum. Once fired, the heavy bullet cuts through air resistance with ease, maintaining its lethal velocity over immense distances and striking its target with a crushing, concentrated force. But the material's true lethality lies in its profound physical vulnerability. Because it is exceptionally soft and malleable, the moment the bullet hits a dense target, like a human bone, it doesn't simply pass through. It violently flattens, expands, and deforms, transferring its entire destructive momentum into the surrounding tissue and tearing a catastrophic path of ruin. This mechanical brutality eventually spilled out of the theater of human war and triggered one of the most severe ecological disasters of the modern wilderness. Millions of spent hunting rounds left behind in fields and wetlands began to devastate the populations of giant, prehistoric scavenging birds. These magnificent creatures, possessing wingspans that could block out the sun, would feed on the remains of animals left behind by hunters, unknowingly ingesting the tiny, shattered fragments of these heavy bullets. Once inside the bird's digestive tract, the aggressive stomach acids effortlessly dissolved the soft metal, converting it into a highly soluble compound that rushed directly into their bloodstreams. The molecular diversant targeted the avian nervous system with terrifying precision, completely paralyzing the involuntary muscles responsible for digestion. These majestic creatures died of absolute starvation with full stomachs, their bodies frozen from the inside out because a single grain of heavy metal had choked off the bioelectric signals keeping them alive. This tragic environmental bottleneck eventually forced governments to implement aggressive bans on traditional ammunition, sparking fierce resistance from powerful industrial groups who insisted the metal was harmless. Yet again, the stubborn physical reality of element 82 stood in direct defiance of human denial. It remains an inescapable truth of our history, whether we used it to paint the light of heaven, to toast the wealth of empires, or to forge the instruments of war. This heavy, patient element has always extracted a heavy price in blood and intellect, reminding us that every step of our technological ascent leaves a permanent toxic signature in the fabric of our world. Today, the overt era of this global contaminant has seemingly drawn to a quiet close. Gas stations no longer pump its toxic vapors into our city streets, and our kitchen walls are no longer coated in its bright leaden paint. We congratulate ourselves on a triumphant victory of public health and regulatory wisdom, believing we have finally banished the universe's quiet agent of entropy from our daily lives. But this sense of security is a profound, dangerous illusion. The billions of tons of this heavy metal that we spent a century frantically digging out of the earth and scattering into the wind have not vanished. They cannot decay, they cannot rot, and they cannot be neutralized by any biological process. They have merely retreated into the shadows, waiting. The vast majority of this molecular saboteur has settled into a thin, permanent layer of topsoil lining our global highways, buried beneath our city parks, and trapped within the deep, silent sediments of our oceans. Every time the wind kicks up a cloud of dust on a dry summer day, or a heavy rain scours an urban street, those ancient, heavy atoms are churned back into motion, drifting through our open windows and settling onto our skin. We have fundamentally altered the geological record of our planet, creating a distinct heavy metal signature that will define our industrial epoch for millions of years to come. If a future civilization ever excavates the ruins of our cities, they will identify the exact moment we nearly traded our collective human intelligence for mechanical speed. Written in a uniform band of element 82, the most intimate and terrifying repository of this industrial debt, however, is not the soil beneath our feet. It is the very skeleton inside you. For those who grew up during the peak of the 20th century automotive boom, this atomic mimic successfully breached their evolutionary defenses and integrated itself into their very bones. It swapped places with calcium, locking itself into the rigid crystalline lattice of their skeletal structure, acting as a patient internal time bomb. This heavy metal can sleep within the human skeleton for decades, a silent passenger masquerading as harmless bone density. But as the human body ages, a natural and unavoidable physical process begins. The bones gradually begin to remineralize, breaking down their old structures to release vital minerals back into the bloodstream. And as the calcium comes out, the long-dormant ions of our heavy metal sniper are unleashed alongside it. For millions of aging individuals, the twilight of life triggers a slow internal chemical betrayal, as the accumulated pollution of their childhood environment is poured back into their blood, launching a secondary delayed assault on their kidneys, their hearts, and the delicate pathways of their brains. It is a biological debt that must be paid, atom by atom, decades after the initial exposure, yet even as we struggle with the biological wreckage of its past, our cutting-edge future is hurtling toward an absolute reliance on this metal's remarkable quantum physics. In the high-stakes world of advanced computation, researchers are using compounds of this heavy element to construct materials that defy the traditional rules of electricity. These structures behave as absolute insulators on the inside, completely blocking the movement of electrons, while their outer surfaces conduct electricity with zero resistance and perfect efficiency. Because our heavy element possesses such an immensely massive nucleus, it exerts a fierce, overpowering relativistic pull on its surrounding electrons, forcing them into a state of intense spin-orbit interaction. This quantum phenomenon allows scientists to guide electrons along the surface of a chip without a single particle scattering or losing its energy as heat. The very substance that spent centuries destroying the delicate wiring of the human brain is now being harnessed to forge the indestructible, hyper-efficient neural pathways of the world's first true quantum supercomputers. We are trusting a notorious biological assassin to build the cradle for our future artificial intelligence. But if you lift your eyes from our terrestrial laboratories and look out into the cold, silent expanse of the cosmos, you discover the ultimate, terrifying truth of this material. It is not just an industrial pollutant, a shield against radiation, or a component in a quantum chip. It is the absolute thermodynamic graveyard of the universe. In the grand ledger of astrophysics, there is an inescapable downward slope toward absolute stillness. The universe began in a state of furious, high-energy simplicity, with light elements fusing together inside the raging hearts of the first stars, building complexity out of chaos. But that creative fire cannot burn forever. The heavy, unstable elements produced in the dying breaths of supernovae and colliding neutron stars are locked in a relentless, agonizing descent of radioactive decay. They shed protons, spit out alpha particles, and bleed energy into the void, desperately searching for a state of matter that can no longer be corrupted by time. And that final, unyielding sanctuary is element 82. Its nucleus is a quantum fortress, so perfectly packed, so immensely stable, that the relentless march of decay stops dead against its walls. Trillions of years from now, long after the last vibrant star has burned through its fuel, after the galaxies have drifted into cold, isolated islands of darkness, and the fires of creation have completely frozen over, the universe will reach its final, static equilibrium. The vast, turbulent complexity of our cosmos, the remnants of dead suns, the ruins of forgotten planets, and the scattered matter of every empire that ever dared to look at the stars, will have slowly, inevitably decayed into cold, silent spheres of this heavy gray metal. It is the absolute zero of nuclear chemistry, the substance in which all material complexity finally surrenders to eternal rest. When you look back at that tiny heavy ball sitting inertly in your hand, you are not just looking at a simple tool for weight or a relic of industrial greed. You are holding a fragment of the universe's ultimate destination. It is a profound monument to human hubris, a substance we thoughtlessly pulled from the earth to accelerate our machines, completely blind to the reality that it was a precise molecular sniper capable of erasing our reason. It stands as a chilling reminder of our cosmic fragility, a silent, patient agent of entropy that watched the birth of our solar system, quietly poisoned the architects of our history, and will ultimately outlive everything we ever build, waiting to inherit the cold and final silence of the cosmos.